Traveling by air in a commercial passenger plane is the safest way to travel. Between 2000 and 2009, only 97 Americans died in aviation-related accidents. Compare that to the number of people who die each year in car accidents in the United States. That number is about 42,000. And still, despite knowing these hard statistics, I still feel a lump in my throat every time my plane is taking off. And I guess it doesn't take a psychologist to figure out why. In a car, you're in control. In a plane, you're not. Being in control represents safety to us, and in a plane, you're surrendering that control to someone that you can't even see. What's also scary about flying for many people is the fact of being trapped and also being very high up. Car crashes tend to happen suddenly, which sure is frightening in its own right, but then imagine being in a plane that's 36,000 feet in the air when something goes wrong, and the plane begins to nosedive. The feeling of being in free fall, of knowing you're gonna die, of the chaos inside of the cabin. For me, it ranks right up there with drowning and being abducted by a serial killer as among the most terrifying of nightmares I can think of. Today's main story combines multiple nightmares into one. Being high up in a plane and knowing you're gonna die, and a crime that's remained and will probably remain unsolved forever. It was January 6th, 1960. It was in the middle of a rainy night in rural North Carolina. A farmer named Richard Randolph was asleep in his bed when suddenly his wife shook his arm and jarred him awake. Then they both heard something. It sounded like an explosion, followed 5 seconds later by another explosion. He got out of bed and looked through the window through the downpour. And off in the distance, he saw a bright flash, which flared for a second and then disappeared. He told himself it was just some thunder and lightning that he had heard, and he went back to bed. The next morning, Richard's teenage son got dressed and ventured to the edge of the property to feed the family's hogs. And that's when he discovered the mangled wreckage of a commercial plane. Richard called the Wilmington airport to report that he discovered a plane. And little could Richard have known, there was already a search underway. Because in the middle of the night, at around 2:30 in the morning, National Airlines Flight 2511 made its last known radio contact, once at 2:07 a.m. and again at 2:31 a.m., to report that the plane was flying over the Carolina Beach radio beacon. And then contact was lost and the plane never arrived at its destination. And when they got word of what Richard Randolph had discovered on his farm, the search was redirected. Once crash investigators arrived at the Randolph farm, they began sifting through the wreckage. They kept discovering more and more of the broken up pieces as they went. And that's when the searchers began recovering bodies. 32 of the 34 people on board were found. The 2 remaining bodies were eventually found, one at the main crash site where all the others were found, and then the other one, weirdly, was found 16 miles away from the main crash site. Now that body was found on January 9th, on the 3rd day of the search. The parts were taken to a hangar at the Wilmington airport where the pieces of the plane were reassembled like pieces of a puzzle over a frame made of wood and chicken wire. Now, what crash investigators were able to then determine from the reassembled wreckage was that the point of origin for where the plane began to come apart was an area just ahead of the leading edge of the plane's right wing. Now, once all the victims were identified, they were each autopsied to determine the cause of death. Of the 34 victims who died in the crash, 33 of them died from crash impact, probably when they hit the ground. But then there was one victim whose injuries were very different from all the rest. And that was the victim who was found 16 miles from the main crash site. Both of his legs had been ripped off. His muscle tissue exhibited extensive mutilation. Debris was found embedded in his body, debris like torn pieces of wire, brass, and a hat ornament. This victim was identified as a man named Julian Andrew Frank. He was easily identified as he had his name written on a collar band inside of his shirt. And in one of his pockets, there was a badge belonging to New York City Deputy Police Commissioner Aaron Frank, who was Julian's father. And what was also interesting about Frank was that he was seated in row 7, which was the row nearest to the part of the plane where investigators believed it had begun to break apart in the air. Now, because of this, investigators decided to look into who Frank was. He was a handsome 32-year-old, seemingly well-to-do attorney who lived with his wife and 2 young children in Westport, Connecticut. And some even remembered him talking about dreaming about someday dying in a plane crash. What investigators also soon learned about Julian Frank was that he had recently come under investigation for allegedly running a charity scam. He had been accused of misappropriating up to $1 million in funds. He was under investigation by the FBI, and he faced disbarment proceedings from the New York State Bar Association. And it also is learned that in the weeks leading up to the incident, Frank had purchased several large life insurance policies totaling nearly $1 million. So obviously this was all making Mr. Frank look worthy of closer scrutiny. It was also learned that Julian Frank had a profound fear of flying, and some investigators had to also consider the possibility that maybe Julian had, in a state of panic, hit the window in such a way that it blew out and set in motion the series of events that downed the plane entirely. Now, chemical compounds that were found in the area near where the explosion took place were found to be consistent with chemical compounds given off by a dynamite explosion. And based on the blast pattern, the CAB found that a dynamite charge had been placed beneath the window seat in row 7, which is exactly where Frank had been seated. So that was the CAB's conclusion. The plane was brought down by dynamite that was placed under Julian Frank's seat. But this begged the question, was Julian Frank responsible? But while the investigation was still failing to come up with proof that Julian Frank was the person responsible, the insurance companies, which from Frank had purchased those policies, they were deciding that Frank was responsible, and they were refusing to pay out these policies to Frank's widow, Janet. They claimed Frank had committed suicide, and they challenged his widow to prove otherwise. Now, ultimately, the investigation closed without naming a suspect in the bombing, which to this day remains officially unsolved. The only conclusion the CAB report could make in their accident report was Mr. Julian A. Frank was in close proximity to the dynamite charge when the detonation occurred. That bomb was purposely brought on that flight that day, but it is still a question as to who brought it and why.